The courtroom was so silent that even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Every eye was fixed on Diddy as the judge prepared to announce the sentence that would determine his fate. The cameras weren't rolling inside, but everyone knew that whatever happened here today would echo far beyond these four walls. Outside, reporters waited in the rain, microphones pointed toward the courthouse doors, desperate for the first sign of what was about to unfold. Inside, however, the atmosphere was almost unreal, thick with anticipation, fear, and something else entirely. Tension that felt ready to snap. Diddy sat motionless, hands folded, eyes locked on the bench. He had been here before, in rooms like this, surrounded by lawyers, flanked by cameras, but this time was different. This wasn't business. This wasn't an interview. This was judgment. The kind of judgment that strips away every layer of fame, power, and influence, leaving behind only the truth. When the judge began to speak, Diddy didn't blink. His jaw tightened slightly, his body perfectly still. The words that followed were slow, deliberate, and devastating. The judge spoke of responsibility, of choices, of consequences that could no longer be ignored. Every sentence landed like a blow, and with each one, the mask that Diddy had worn for years, the calm confidence, the control, began to crack. For the first time, the man who had built an empire on charisma and authority looked small, vulnerable, and uncertain. The gavel came down hard, sealing his fate. The decision was final. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. His legal team froze. The sound of a reporter's pen hitting the floor echoed louder than it should have. Diddy's breathing quickened, his eyes darting toward the judge, and for a moment, it looked as though time had stopped. Those who were there would later describe it as a look they would never forget. A mix of disbelief, rage, and heartbreak colliding in real time. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The judge, calm but firm, reminded him that the hearing was over, that any further statement would need to come through his counsel. But Diddy wasn't hearing that anymore. His entire world, the carefully crafted persona, the loyalty of his inner circle, the illusion of control, had just collapsed in front of him. Years of pressure, of silence, of pretending everything was fine, suddenly boiled to the surface. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor with a harsh screech. Gasps rippled through the room again as guards instinctively moved closer. Diddy didn't lash out. He didn't even raise his voice. But there was something in his eyes, a storm that had been brewing for far too long. He pointed toward the bench, not in defiance, but in desperation, his words shaking as they finally broke free. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "None of you do." The judge remained composed, watching carefully, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. What had been a structured legal proceeding had turned into something raw and unpredictable. The collapse of a man who had spent his life convincing the world he couldn't break. His lawyers tried to calm him, whispering for him to sit down, but he ignored them. His words came faster now, spilling out like a confession and a plea all at once. "You think this is justice?" he said. "You think this ends here?" The courtroom deputies stepped forward, but he didn't resist. He was no longer fighting the system. He was fighting himself. The crowd murmured, some shocked, some oddly sympathetic, as the man who once seemed untouchable stood on the edge of complete emotional collapse. The judge's tone softened slightly as he ordered a brief recess, perhaps recognizing that this was no longer just a legal matter but a human one. As Diddy was escorted back to his seat, his breathing slowed, his expression distant. The courtroom felt haunted, not by violence, but by truth. It wasn't the outburst of a criminal. It was the breaking point of a man who had built his life on control and just realized it was an illusion. Reporters would later call it the moment the mask shattered. Psychologists on television panels would analyze his body language, his tone, even the way his hands shook when he spoke. But those who were in the room knew better. They had seen something deeper. A man confronting not just his sentence, but his reflection. When the judge returned, the tension hadn't faded. The air still buzzed with unspoken fear and fascination. Diddy sat silently now, his face pale, his eyes lowered. He wasn't the same man who had walked in hours earlier. Something inside him had shifted, permanently. He no longer looked like someone planning his next move. He looked like someone finally accepting that there was no move left to make. Outside, the media frenzy exploded as word spread of the dramatic courtroom scene. Anchors spoke in urgent tones, calling it the outburst that stunned the nation. Commentators speculated about what had triggered it, whether it was guilt, frustration, or something more mysterious. But those inside knew the truth. It wasn't just the sentence that broke him. It was the realization that for the first time in his life, he couldn't rewrite the ending. And as he sat there, surrounded by flashing lights and whispered voices, Diddy's eyes lifted one last time toward the bench. His expression wasn't anger anymore. It was something else entirely. The quiet, hollow understanding that this moment, this reckoning, was the price he had always been running from. When the news broke that Diddy had lost control in the courtroom, the media went into overdrive. Within minutes, every major outlet was replaying the scene in slow motion, analyzing every flicker of emotion across his face. Commentators filled the airwaves with speculation. Was it rage, grief, or something more complicated? The truth was simpler but far more unsettling. It was the look of a man finally realizing he wasn't invincible. Outside the courthouse, the chaos had reached fever pitch. Reporters shouted questions into the rain, their microphones raised toward the building like weapons of curiosity. Fans gathered behind barricades, chanting, crying, arguing, each one convinced they understood what was really happening. Some defended him, saying he was being pushed too far by a system that never forgave the powerful when they fell. Others called it karma, the inevitable collapse of an empire built on ego and silence. Inside, the courtroom remained eerily still. The judge had left for chambers, leaving only a handful of officers, Diddy's legal team, and a few stunned onlookers who couldn't quite process what they had witnessed. His lawyers whispered urgently, trying to prepare a statement before the media storm swallowed the narrative whole. But Diddy sat quietly, staring at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. Everything he had ever controlled, every press release, every public moment, had slipped through his fingers in a matter of seconds. One of his attorneys leaned close. "We can still fix this," she said softly. But even she didn't sound convinced. Diddy turned toward her with an expression that was calm but distant. "You can't fix the truth," he said. "You can only live with it." Those words would later become a viral quote, replayed endlessly in news segments, podcasts, and TikTok edits. Some called it profound. Others called it scripted. But those who had been in the room knew that nothing about that moment was planned. It was the voice of someone standing on the edge between guilt and freedom. Not freedom from the law, but from the lies that had once defined him. As the hours passed, the narrative outside began to spiral out of control. Anonymous sources emerged, each claiming to know what had triggered his reaction. Some said it was betrayal from inside his own team. Others hinted at hidden evidence the judge had referenced before sentencing. None of it was confirmed, but that didn't matter. The mystery was fuel, and the world was addicted. Talk shows and panel discussions popped up overnight. Former colleagues, old friends, and self-proclaimed insiders appeared on camera, dissecting his every move. They spoke about the man behind the music, the businessman behind the empire, the secrets behind the success. But beneath the noise, one question kept resurfacing. What really broke him that day? Meanwhile, Diddy was moved to a private holding facility away from the public eye. There, he was given a simple room with no cameras, no assistants, no entourage. Just four walls and his thoughts. For someone who had spent a lifetime surrounded by people, the silence was unbearable. For the first time, there was no one to manage his image, no one to spin his pain into a headline. Just him and the echoes of everything he had tried to bury. Those close to the case later revealed that he spent hours staring out the small window, barely speaking. When asked if he regretted what happened, he reportedly said, "No. I regret waiting this long to feel something real." That statement, like everything else he said, became another media weapon. Half the world saw it as arrogance, the other half as awakening. Back in the city, the streets were filled with discussion. Coffee shops buzzed with debates. Social media burned with hashtags. Hashtag justice for truth. Hashtag Diddy breaks down. Hashtag empire fallen. Even those who had never followed his career found themselves captivated by the downfall. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It had become a mirror for everyone watching, a reminder of how thin the line between power and collapse really was. In an unexpected twist, the court later released a transcript of the hearing to calm the speculation. Reading it was like peering into the anatomy of a breakdown. The words that had sounded explosive in headlines were, in print, almost heartbreakingly human. "I'm not angry," one line read. "I'm just tired of pretending this is justice." Another read,
"You can take everything I have, but at least now I don't have to lie."
Those words hit harder than any verdict. Meanwhile, inside the holding cell, Diddy's demeanor began to change. The exhaustion that had weighed him down turned into something else. Reflection. He started writing, filling page after page of a worn legal pad that guards said he carried everywhere. No one knew what he was writing. A memoir, a confession, maybe just thoughts. But whatever it was, it gave him focus. Journalists soon learned of it and labeled it the Prison Journal. For weeks, rumors spread that he was preparing to tell everything. Not to a court or a network, but in his own words. And for the first time, the world that had once chased his downfall began to lean in again. This time not for scandal, but for truth. But deep inside, Diddy knew that truth wasn't a story you controlled. It was something that controlled you. The sentence, the headlines, the humiliation, they had stripped away the illusion, but in doing so, they had given him something he hadn't had in years: honesty. As night fell over the city, a quiet unease hung in the air. The judge's decision still stood. The empire was gone. But somewhere in that silence, Diddy was beginning to see something that power had once blinded him to. The fragile, painful freedom that comes when you have nothing left to hide. Weeks had passed since that chaotic day in court, but the world was still talking about Diddy. Every podcast, every news panel, every digital feed seemed to orbit the same mystery. What was inside the journal he had started writing after the sentencing? Some claimed it was a confession. Others called it a manifesto. But no one knew for sure, because for once in his life, Diddy wasn't talking. The man who had once dominated every headline had gone silent, and that silence had become louder than any statement he could make. Inside the facility, Diddy's routine had settled into something quiet, almost monastic. He spent hours in reflection, often pacing the small space or writing by the dim light of a desk lamp. The guards noticed how he had changed. No outbursts, no arrogance, no signs of the larger-than-life figure who used to walk into rooms like he owned the air itself. Now he spoke in measured tones, thanked people politely, and spent long stretches just staring out of the tiny window. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened had cracked him open, but instead of falling apart, he was beginning to rebuild. Then, one morning, his attorney arrived with news. A national publication had filed a formal request to access the written pages under the banner of public interest. The world wanted to read his thoughts. His first reaction was silence, followed by a faint smile. "They've had my words for years," he said softly. "Maybe it's time they hear my truth." When excerpts of the Prison Journal were finally published, they hit like lightning. The first lines were almost poetic. Not angry, not defensive, but startlingly honest. "I thought fame was freedom," it began. "But fame is just another kind of cell, the one you decorate yourself." Those words spread across social media in hours, quoted by celebrities, academics, and ordinary people who felt an uncomfortable resonance in them. The internet, for once, didn't mock him. It listened. Over the following weeks, more excerpts appeared. He wrote about the cost of silence, the addiction to validation, and the way power corrupts not through money or fame, but through fear, the fear of losing it. "The higher you climb," one passage read, "the harder it is to hear the truth. You start hiring people to protect you from reality." That line, in particular, became a cultural echo. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever mistaken attention for love, or applause for peace. Outside the walls of his confinement, the impact was seismic. Universities used his journal in lectures about media and morality. News networks debated whether his transformation was genuine or a carefully crafted redemption arc. But the people, the ordinary viewers and listeners, seemed to sense something deeper. They saw not just a fallen mogul, but a reflection of the modern obsession with perfection. The man who had once ruled stages now ruled conversations about vulnerability. Yet behind the growing myth, Diddy remained quiet. Those close to him said he never watched the news coverage, never read the headlines about his own redemption. He continued to write, not for the world, but for himself. When asked in an interview if he sought forgiveness, he replied, "Forgiveness isn't something you seek, it's something you earn by not running anymore." The judge who had once sentenced him even commented publicly months later, saying, "Sometimes, justice doesn't end with punishment, it begins with truth." That statement stirred even more debate. Critics argued that the media was turning Diddy into a martyr. Supporters said his story had become something rare, a cautionary tale that didn't glorify the fall, but honor the honesty that followed it. By the end of the year, the prison journal had been compiled into a published memoir, with all proceeds donated to youth mentorship programs focused on creative responsibility, a cause Diddy personally chose. The book became a phenomenon, not because of its scandal, but because of its sincerity. There were no excuses inside its pages, no sensational confessions, just reflections on the emptiness of unchecked ambition and the redemption found in truth. Critics praised it as the most brutally self-aware book ever written by a fallen star, while others called it a performance. But it didn't matter. The point was never how the world saw him. The point was that for the first time, Diddy had stopped performing altogether. One of the final entries in the journal read, "They called me a legend, a boss, a villain. But none of those were me. I was just a man afraid of silence.
Now in silence, I finally understand who I am."
That final line was quoted on magazine covers, documentaries, and endless TikTok edits that paired it with his old footage. The man in the spotlight contrasted against the man in the cell. It became the story of transformation, the fall of an icon and the rise of a truth teller. And though debate still raged about his past, something had shifted. For once, his name wasn't synonymous with power. It was synonymous with awareness. When Diddy was finally released, months later, there were no red carpets, no interviews, no entourage waiting outside. Just a quiet walk into the morning light. No one knew what he would do next. Whether he would disappear or rebuild. Whether he would speak again or let the silence continue his story. But as he stepped forward, free in the simplest, truest sense, it felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another. Because in the end, what defined him wasn't the fame or the fall. It was the truth that followed. And maybe that was the message the world needed most.